Southeast Asia. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to USAI, thank you for joining us. My name is Leon Cao, and I am the program assistant at the US-Asia Institute. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between people and governments of the United States and Asia. First, I'd like to give you a special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Mega Valentina. Ms. Mega Valentina is the Senior Manager at the US-ASEAN Business Council, where her portfolio includes leading the advocacy and intelligence aspects of the Brunei and Indonesia regions. She has an expertise in government relations, cross-cultural communications, and in various economic areas such as trade facilitation, standards, and regulatory frameworks surrounding the automotive, technology, and health sectors. Prior to joining the Business Council, Ms. Mega Valentina worked in advocacy and branding to facilitate trade. We are very fortunate to have her with us, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Mega, to introduce today's panel panelists and kick off this briefing.
Thank you so much, Leon, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 13th session of USAI's Southeast Asia in Focus. So I'm Mega, and I'm going to be your moderator today. As mentioned, I'm the Senior Manager at the US-ASEAN Business Council. I oversee country portfolios such as Indonesia and Brunei, as well as financial services portfolio for all ASEAN countries. And I have also worked at the ASEAN Secretariat back in Jakarta, my hometown, and I facilitated ASEAN countries to negotiate agreements on several trade issues back then. And I'm thrilled to be here with you today. I would also like to welcome all the congressional staffers and DC professionals. Thank you for joining us today. And in today's briefing, we'll hear from our panels who will provide an overview of the recent political developments and trajectory of democracy in Southeast Asia. Then the panel will take time to answer your questions in the final 15 minutes. So please do send your questions to us. You can put your questions on the chat box or Q&A functions at any time. And now I'd like to start with introducing our first panelist today, Dr. Andrew Welsdang. Dr. Welsdang is a senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace. He's focusing on Southeast Asia and Vietnam. He joined USIP 18 months ago and has since been leading the Institute's Vietnam War Legacies and Reconciliation Initiative. Prior to his current position, he worked in Vietnam and various other countries in the region, deeply engaged with NGOs as senior governance advisor and representatives of organizations such as Oxfam International, etc. Dr. Welsdang holds a doctorate in political science from University of Birmingham and is also noted for his expertise in governance and legacies of war. I also have the great pleasure to introduce our panelist, Mr. Ben Dolven. Mr. Dolven is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, or CRS, where he focuses on Southeast Asia. Prior to joining CRS in 2008, he worked as a journalist, business consultant, and a teacher over his 20 years of career, which mostly was spent in Asia. Mr. Dolven was a senior consultant for Brooks Bauer Group and a senior editor, correspondent, and a bureau chief for the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Andrew and Ben, who will share with you their insights on the trajectories of political stability and democratic resilience in Southeast Asia. Andrew and Ben, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mega, for the introduction, and glad to have a chance to speak with all of you today. As you may know, U.S. Institute of Peace was founded by Congress in 1984 with a mission of preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict around the world. So I work both on the resolution and reconciliation side and in terms of conflict prevention in Southeast Asia. I'll be talking mainly about mainland Southeast Asia, and then Ben will give a view from the maritime countries. So, I mean, a couple of things strike me about Southeast Asia at the moment. One of them is that the trend is towards more authoritarian rule in recent years. It's always been the norm. That is, the majority of states have been more authoritarian or liberal, democratic. There's been fluctuation over time. But in recent years, with the coup in Thailand in 2014, crackdown on the opposition in Cambodia in 2017, and the coup in Myanmar in 2021, for instance, it's been getting more restrictive. At the same time, the region's importance to the US has been increasing in strategic terms, also economically and politically. So these things are happening at the same time. Why? Well, some of it has to do with the role of China and influence of China. Some of it is global changes, like a narrowing of civic space that's observable all around the world. But a lot of it has to do with domestic political factors in each of the countries that are quite different and yet produce some of the same results. The idea of like which country in the region is most democratic has changed over time. For a while, it was Myanmar. Now it might be Malaysia. And if Timor-Leste joins ASEAN, then it would be in that position. But mostly the countries are trying to avoid being the least democratic because, yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is in Myanmar. Perhaps some other countries might be happy that the situation in Myanmar is so awful because it gets their abuses off of the headlines. Meanwhile, the military regime in Myanmar looks at Thailand and thinks, how did they have a coup and get away with it? And their economy is still going great while ours is falling by the day. So in this way, political stability and democracy have often been seen as opposites in Southeast Asia. You know, democracy can be messy, even chaotic sometimes. There's opposition. And when we have a lot of partisan divisions in the US and other democratic countries, that's not a great look for some Southeast Asians. Views of the US have improved in recent years. The highest in the world actually is Vietnam. At 84% of people have a positive view of the US and also had a positive view of President Trump and President Biden. Philippines is next at 78%, and it goes down from there, but still surprisingly strong positive views of the US across the region, despite having very different political systems. So for most countries, I think their potential to be more democratic is there, but it really depends on domestic factors. It's affected somewhat by their neighbors, but I don't see a lot of movement that way either. So I would expect that most countries in this region will be authoritarian for some time. But if there's a change somewhere, it could have positive ripple effects on others. And that's the kind of thing that I'd hope to look for. So I'll talk more about specific countries, I think, later on, but just leave it there as a start. And over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Mega, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. I second everything Andrew just said. It's clear across the region that there have been movements over the past decade towards authoritarianism in many of the region's countries. across maritime Southeast Asia, a number of, well, it's a very big year, right? Indonesia, the region's largest country by a long ways, prepares for national elections in early 2024. And that makes this a year in which that process is going to dominate a lot of what happens in Jakarta, and a lot of decision making as well will be reflected in the political through the political prisms. New governments in Malaysia and in the Philippines will, to some degree, consolidate and become what they are to become. The Philippines, which has been a democratic success story in the region since 1986, since the People's Power Revolution, conducted an election last year. There was a great deal. One of the things that is a threat, not just in Southeast Asia, but across the world, the misinformation and the use of social media to create narratives that rewrite history, was something that was very much talked about in the Philippines last year. The rewriting of the Ferdinand Marcos era, which paved the way for Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos's election, was very much part of the narrative of what was happening in the Philippines politically. Marcos was elected comfortably, and from the perspective of the political process, for the second presidential election in a row, there's no doubt that the Philippine people got who they chose, right? There were not questions, as there have been in the past in the Philippines, of electoral manipulation. And the Philippines went to the polls. They voted for Marcos last year. They voted for Rodrigo Duterte 7 years ago. And the question about the Philippine democracy's ability to deliver to the Philippine people what they chose, well, the choosing part is not in question. The question of whether the Philippine system can deliver for economic livelihoods, cracking down on corruption, remain really, really, really difficult. The political process sort of overlays a system in which a lot of the flaws, the institutional flaws of governing a large country remain. That's I think one of the things in Indonesia, it's now been 25 years since Indonesia went through its transformation with the demonstrations that toppled an authoritarian regime and kicked Indonesia into a process of democratization that for a long time have put it in one of those categories that Andrew talked about. What is the most democratic state in Southeast Asia? Indonesia is one of them. But I think one of the real challenges is whether the processes begin to lead to more, better policy making, crackdowns on corruption. It's incredibly difficult in Indonesia. And one of the things about Indonesian politics is it has become so thoroughly decentralized that in a country as large as Indonesia, the number of parties who are involved in governing the country is so great that it is very, very difficult to manage the process. I think, Mega, if you have dealt with business processes in Indonesia, you can attest to that. Malaysia, again, you never would have called Malaysia one of the more democratic countries in the region until the last two elections, in which genuinely contested elections led to the election and creation of coalition governments that have tried to govern. I mean, Malaysian politics is such a morass of political parties and coalitions and backroom dealing that leads to the formation of a government, that it's kind of hard to say at this point that Malaysia has made the turn. But Malaysia has contested elections twice now in a row, and has elected and has changed governments twice electorally. And that's sort of the beginning of the process that's, it makes the next couple of years really, really important to see whether this particular coalition, which is a fractious coalition of people who don't agree on much, can hold itself together and govern the country. I think that'll be really important to watch in the years ahead. As Andrew said, maritime Southeast Asia is similar. The questions of US-China rivalry in the region hang really heavy. The questions of what ASEAN as an institution and what ASEAN's members are going to do with the crisis in Myanmar weighs really, really heavily. I think across Southeast Asia, most governments lean in perhaps a little bit more strongly than the countries of mainland Southeast Asia. But ASEAN as an institution has yet to really, really move the dial much at all on Myanmar. Happy to talk about individual countries going forward, but happy to turn it over to questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben and Andrew. Very, very interesting. A lot of dynamic in Southeast Asia, and I agree with you. It's there are a lot of a huge range of developments, and it's kind of scary in terms of democracy. There's, as you said, the rewriting of the Marcos regime. The recent resignation of Vietnamese president is also on the news recently, and not to mention that this is marked the 2-year anniversary of the coup in Myanmar, and the junta still remains in power, and there's still a lot of violence, and a lot of also violence in the anti-government demonstrations in Thailand prior to their 2023 general election. And we will see what the 2024 election of Indonesia will bring. But yeah, all of these issues have created huge, if I can borrow what our colleague Prasan Pramaswaran wrote on his paper in Wilson Center, there's a huge democratic discontent in Southeast Asia. And I also understand that such crisis and instability have been worsened by the global food energy supply chain crisis caused by the war, the pandemic, etc. And this has left so many people, including us, who are from Southeast Asia, wondering about the democracy, the future of democracy in ASEAN. Is democracy on the brink of crisis as well? So yeah, that's a bit worrying for some people, for many people. And meanwhile, some people or some of our audience here might be wondering, why is this all relevant to the US? I might gonna step back a little bit and mention that ASEAN has the 3rd largest population in the world after China and India. Combined GDP is more than 3 trillion in 2021 and ranks the 3rd largest economy in Asia. And it was the 6th largest economy in the world by 2 years ago. But as of last year, ASEAN now has emerged as the world's 5th largest economy, 5th largest in the world. And it's still on track to become the 4th largest by 2030. And so you have also, our panelists have also mentioned the importance of US-ASEAN relationship for trade. ASEAN represents the world's fourth largest market, and the United States is ASEAN's largest source of FDI investment. Also, as a major partner and key stakeholder in ASEAN, especially as the US-China tension is still going on, the US is increasingly more important for the US as a key stakeholder in ASEAN to pay attention to these dynamics in ASEAN. And and also the fact that the Philippines and Indonesia made it to the top 7 largest democracy in the world, along with the US, and the fact that the US has influenced and impacted our democracy trend in Southeast Asia, that is proof that ASEAN matters to the US and the US matters to ASEAN. I will go straight to some of the questions that I have here, and I'm gonna dig deeper into specific ASEAN countries and the issues, the political issues in some of the ASEAN countries. Probably I will start with Dr. Wells Dang. For Vietnam, so in the last month, the Vietnamese president Nguyen Phúc has resigned, and he resigned after only become the president for 2 years. And also there's a dismissal of 2 deputy prime minister who were working under him when he was a PM, and the media said that event led to his resignation as a president. And some of the US private sector thought that it's a loss for Vietnam, because US companies or US businesses loved him because he was quite open to engage with the US private sector and had contributed a lot to the bilateral relationship during his time as the prime minister, especially. And so I'd like to kind of ask a little bit about the recent development. Is there any indication of who will replace him? And what do you think the implication of the resignation for the political stability in the country? And is there any implication for the US relations with Vietnam?
Great, thanks, Mega, for the question and that background. That's all correct. It's kept Vietnam watchers riveted for the last few months to try to figure out what's going on. I mean, the basic fact of Vietnam is that it's a single-party state controlled by the Communist Party. So the important person here is not the president or the prime minister, it's the general secretary of the party, Nguyễn Phú Trọng. So he's the one making the decisions. And actually, in the past, there was more of a balance between the party and the government, but now it's really tilted towards the party being in control. So the party was in control before these personnel changes, and it's still in control after. Which means that this is not really instability. I think the policies of the Vietnamese government are going to stay the same, including economic opening, political repression, balancing between China and the US. It's just that the people in these key positions are different. So the person who is pegged to be the next president is named Vo Van Thuong, and he was a provincial party leader from a province outside Hanoi who doesn't have any international experience. Same with the people who are the new deputy prime ministers. So it's going to take them some time to build the relationships that their predecessors had, get accustomed to what their new jobs require. They're ultimately loyal to the party, right? But that's true of everyone in the Vietnamese leadership. The thing that brought about the fall of Nguyen Xuân Phúc and the 2 DPMs are a couple of corruption cases that happened during COVID. One of them was a scandal about fake COVID tests. And another one was people being overcharged for repatriation flights from the US and other countries back to Vietnam. And, some of the top officials were found to have directly profited from bribes and corruption in these cases. For others, they weren't directly involved, but they were held responsible because people under them were involved, which is actually more accountability for corruption than there's been in Vietnam in the past. So it was a little bit surprising to see who all was included in this. But I would point out that these top officials negotiated their exit. They weren't arrested or thrown out of the party. So they have some protection and dignity, whereas there are other lower ranking officials, including ambassadors who were arrested. So that's quite serious. And again, it will have some short-term effects. One of the things I've noticed is that many people in Vietnam seem more cautious than usual about doing anything new and taking any chances, because the system clearly doesn't reward that at the moment. So that will have effects in slowing down progress. But in a way, I think for US-Vietnam relations, there's an opportunity, which is the new people want to show that they're not changing things, that they want to keep on the party's policies. So it may be an opportunity for them to strengthen relations with the US to demonstrate that. So I hope the US can find ways of working with them. I don't think it's a shift in Vietnam's policies, and yeah, the party's still in control. Whether there's a strategic partnership upgrade this year between the US and Vietnam remains to be seen. This is the 10th anniversary of our comprehensive partnership with Vietnam. So there's a lot of discussion now about, okay, if it becomes a strategic partnership, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that Vietnam is going to move closer to the US and against China, because they're right next to China. They have close party-to-party relations. That's not going to change. But there may be ways to increase cooperation with the US in some areas without disturbing the Chinese too much. I think that's what they're thinking at this time.
Thank you so much for your elaboration. Ben, if you have anything to add, please feel free to jump anytime. Yeah, that is questions on Vietnam. I also saw on the Q&A section, we have a comment about an audience interest in experts' comments on Thailand. We'll get into that soon. But I think I'm gonna, before we jump to Thailand, I have a question for Mr. Dolven on Malaysia. So last November, the longtime statement Anwar Ibrahim has been sworn in as Malaysia's 10th prime minister. That happened after an election deadlock, and there was also a motion of confidence, and in which he won it. He won the motion of confidence in Parliament. So that's the politic dynamic in Malaysia is always very interesting. There's always something going on within like short amount of time. I can barely follow, but I also read recently that PM Anwar formed a key coalition in the government, and he formed the United Malay National Organizations, UMNO, and this organization is holding a party election from early February to mid-March. And in late January, this organization, UMNO, passed a motion declaring that no members will be allowed to challenge the party president or his deputy in those elections. So this is just one of the example of what I see as a red flag, was one of the red flags in Malaysian democracy. So my question is, how do you think Mr. Anwar or PM Anwar's leadership in this election or after this election, and how does all this dynamic under his leadership affects the democracy in Malaysia? Over to you, Ben.
All right, thanks, Mega. Yeah, Malaysian politics, unpacking Malaysian politics is like peeling an onion. There is so much under the layer, under this layer, and then under the next layer, and under the next layer. PM Anwar Ibrahim, his story is one of the most unlikely political stories in the region of the last 50 years, right? He was the prime minister in waiting, universally recognized as such in Malaysia until 1998, when under the backdrop of the Asian financial crisis and economic turmoil throughout the region, including Malaysia, broke with Prime Minister Mahathir publicly and consigned himself to 25 years in the political wilderness, convicted of crimes largely considered to be political in origin, banned from running for election, rose as an oppositionist, and had reached a point where people thought it just increasingly unlikely that he'd ever get back to the point, and then he did. This is one of the things I was talking about. The Malaysian politics have been genuinely fought over, right? That the outcomes of elections are no longer preordained as they had been for many years. But in order to form his coalition, Anwar chose to the king of Malaysia named Anwar, whose party had won more votes than any other in the election, but had not garnered a majority, as given the right to go form a coalition and see if you can form a government. In order to do so, he came into coalition with UMNO, as you mentioned, the United Malays National Organization, a long time, for many years, the dominant political party in Malaysia. UMNO has splintered in recent years, throwing Malaysian politics into a great deal of crisis. I mean, politics in Malaysia used to be pretty easy to understand. It was all about what happened within the dominant political party, within UMNO. And while it was not transparent in any way, shape, or form, it was clear that within UMNO, the inter-party battles that took place behind the scenes governed who came to power. Who, for many years, that was Mahathir Mohamad as the prime minister, and then the whole question of who got the ministries, and importantly, the ministries where a minister could make a lot of money, was kind of hashed out behind closed doors. At this point, there's more transparency in Malaysia, in a sense, in that there is no dominant political party in the country anymore. There are a series of parties that are seeking the largest share of parliament, giving them the greatest leverage in battles for coalitions. And then the coalition forming leads to, in this case, marriages of great inconvenience. There's not a heck of a lot that Anwar and much of UMNO agree upon as far as what direction Malaysia should go. The the horse trading is what puts together the government. And I think that this will be the challenge, right? UMNO is set for leadership elections. All signals are that that the leader Zahid Hamidi is going to run it through so that UMNO after these looks largely like UMNO does today. But Anwar's ability to keep all of his coalition parties, primarily UMNO, happy is what's going to govern whether that government survives. So it's not a picture of great political stability. It's a picture that kind of is going to make it difficult to kind of piece together. I mean, I think, as you said, you see political news about Malaysia, and it's difficult to determine what it means. I think for the foreseeable future, what it means is political survival and the ability of Anwar to hang on to a coalition that he doesn't necessarily, it's no guarantee that he will hang on to the coalition. It's important to remember, after the last election, right in the heart of the pandemic, Malaysia underwent a thoroughly non-electoral change of government. Parts of a political coalition backed away from Mahathir Mohamad, the prime minister at the time, and without election, a new government was seated. In many ways, I think a lot of the democratic dividend of the early part of the last decade was kind of tossed away, and that electoral change happened without elections. Could it happen again? Yes, it could happen again. We'll see.
Sorry, I live near the Capitol Hill, so there are a lot of these noises at any time of the day or night, unfortunately. Wow, okay. There are a lot of layers to elaborate or to discuss for sure, but I will for now. And to our audience, please feel free to put your questions, follow-up questions, or even questions on the issues that have not been discussed. Please put it on the chat or Q&A box. For now, I'm going to move on to Thailand. Questions for Andrew. So we have an incoming election in Thailand this year in May. That's the schedule. And there are a lot of things going on leading to the election other than the anti-government movement. There's this Prayut's break with the main military faction, and also the continued influence of military members in the Senate and the chances of the Sinawarta faction. We also read about the ruling party who has officially nominated the Deputy Prime Minister Wong Suwan as its sole PM candidate. And a lot of people didn't think that was a surprise, but it's going to be a sort of like a contest between the Deputy Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha, who is also running for re-election. So I would like to ask your take on this, on these issues, and how will these dynamic affect the election, and what do you think you foresee as the outcome of the upcoming election in Thailand? That is a question for Andrew. Over to you.
Thanks, Mega. Yeah, and thanks also, Gregory and Reed, for your questions in the chat. I'll try to address that. So, I mean, Thailand is a U.S. ally, right? Ruled by a military-led government. It also has close relations with China. and it's kind of a political outlier in that the monarchy is almost in the place of a single party or political leadership. And I think the million baht question is the one there. Why does the Thailand economy do so well despite the coup? That there's like a kind of decoupling between Thai politics and the economy. The economy almost runs on its own. There's plenty of foreign investment, including from the US, that continues despite whatever is happening on the streets. And that's been pretty much the same dynamic since around 2000, when Thaksin Shinawatra first came in, that politically there's been a divide between illiberal Democrats, so the Reds, who are in the majority, led by the Shinawatra clan, and the anti-democratic liberals, who are the Yellows, the royalists and military faction, who are in the minority, and they've taken turns leading the country. Yet this hasn't really affected the Thai economy or society, despite the sometimes massive protests going on in Bangkok. So in 2006 and again 2014, right, the royalists came to power in a coup, but eventually they set up elections and they're not able to win the elections because they don't actually have majority support. And now it's the same situation again, where the Shinawatra faction is poised to come back. In the last opinion polls I saw, so Ung Ing, who's the youngest daughter of Thaksin, is leading with 43% in the last poll. So her Thai party, I think, is likely to win a majority if the military permits it, right? But they probably don't have any choice at this point. They've held on as long as they can. And the fact that the Yellow faction is divided and has multiple candidates, as Mega pointed out, that makes it sort of more likely. In terms of protests, so in 2020 and 21, there were large-scale protests led by young people on the streets, and they were calling for a new constitution, which there is now. They were calling to remove the Prime Minister Prayut and to reform the monarchy. Well, those two haven't happened yet. The monarchy is the hardest one. The youth-led party called Future Forward that was formed was forced to dissolve by the courts. There is a new party continuing that, but it seems like a lot of the support has gone back to the Shinawatras. And so it's now all about the election, I think, right? Everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen in May. So yeah, in the long term, can the pro-democracy groups come back into a position where the majority rules in Thailand? It doesn't mean it's going to be a clean or open democracy all the time, but that would mean that over the long term, the role of the palace would decline, which is something, again, the king now doesn't have quite the same support and reputation that his father had. So I can see that happening, but it's still quite up in the air, I think, where it goes. What's it like if the Shinawatra family comes back into power? Probably not much different than the previous times. In the Philippines now, we're seeing the second coming of the Marcoses. It looks quite different from the first coming so far, pleasantly so. And that might turn out to be the case in Thailand as well. I mean, Ung Ing is in her mid-30s, so she would be one of the youngest leaders of any country in the region or beyond. But that's what it seems like it's heading towards at the moment.
Thank you, Andrew. I like your term second coming, which is pretty much what is happening in Thailand. I mean, in the Philippines. Okay. in the interest of time, I am going to jump to the next question. And this is for Ben. We're going to talk about a little bit about Indonesia. They are the ASEAN chair this year, and they just finished a successful presidency for G20 last year. And they are basically getting all the spotlights recently as or holding leadership positions in ASEAN and in the region recently, and this, especially this year. Not to mention, they are also, I should say we, because I'm Indonesian, we are also looking forward to the general election in February 2024. So not less dynamic than the neighboring countries. A lot of concerns also were raised towards Indonesian government, noting the recent controversy of the omnibus law, and also the new criminal code that some people said it's a threat to the human rights in Indonesia and in general in the world. Also, a lot of the concerns still related to the human rights violations. There are a lot of history that surrounding one of the presidential candidate who's currently the defense minister, Prabowo Subianto, because he was, according to the International Criminal Court, was guilty or was responsible for the 1998 riot in Indonesia, for example, and the fact that he was leading the poll, the election poll. It was a concern to a lot of people. But today, as of this month, we have also a new presidential candidate. He's not officially a candidate yet, but we have a new, like, popular potential candidate, which is the Central Java Governor Ganjar Pranowo. And there's this borrowing Prasant term, this content, there's this hope mixed together, a lot of different events happening at the same time, a lot of worries and concerns around Indonesia's government and future government, not to mention that at the same time they're preparing for the move to the new capital city as well. So yeah, I just want to ask you, what's your take, what's your view on all of this dynamic, and what do you foresee, similar to the previous question, what do you foresee will come out of the 2024 election for Indonesia?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Busy year. Yeah, the shape of the presidential race for 2024 is starting to take shape. And as you mentioned, Ganjar Pranowo, the governor of Central Java, has emerged in a way that is not unlike the way that current President Joko Widodo kind of came from. Widodo was a mayor of a medium-sized city but on the basis of personal popularity, though he was a political outsider, very much a political outsider 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, just carried a wave of popularity to the presidency. To some degree, many of the sort of traditional elites might have sought to stand in the way and were just unable to. I mean, that was sort of in a way a testament to Indonesia's democratic process and its development. In many ways, Indonesian elections often are about the old and the new. The political institutional forces, like and you mentioned Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto, he's run in each of the one and lost decisively in each of the last two presidential elections. Here he is again. The other figure in this is former President Megawati Soekarno-Putri, who is sort of the champion of the largest political party in Indonesia, and has an enormous amount to say on what direction that party is going to throw its weight. It could throw its weight behind Ganjar Pranowo, and it could be a very smooth sailing into the presidency for him. He is, his reputation is fairly strong on corruption fighting. He's a populist. He's good on the campaign trail. But there are other figures, including Megawati's daughter, who she has long sought to elevate to the presidency or the vice presidency, perhaps in coalition with somebody else, perhaps with Prabowo. There are all kinds of ways in which the traditional, the old forces could steer this election. I would say that Indonesia has elected two presidents and then re-elected each for the past 20 years. In both cases, I think it's fair to say Indonesia chose the new, not the old. In many ways, Prabowo, certainly in the most recent election, but before that too, sought very much to kind of cast a sense that Indonesia used to work better when it was authoritarian, and this whole democratic stuff has led to chaos, and what we really need is a strong man who can get things done. Prabowo lost both of those elections fairly decisively. But again, I think we're kind of setting up the fight between the new and the old, and we'll see whether Indonesia makes the same choice this time. It's ASEAN chair. I'll just say simply, Indonesia's drawn a really tough card. ASEAN is divided wildly about what to do with the crisis in Myanmar, to the point that Thailand hosted a meeting of some ASEAN foreign ministers and the foreign minister representing the junta in Myanmar, which half of ASEAN didn't show up to. It was sort of a level of divide that is really unusual for the group. Indonesia has a good deal of sort of diplomatic force as ASEAN's largest member, but ASEAN as a group is a deep challenge for it. Indonesia also came out, was it last week, and said we're going to push forward aggressively with China on the negotiations over a code of conduct for parties in the South China Sea. Well, good luck. I mean, that is it manages the group at a time when what we call great power rivalry in the region is growing more intense, and that's a really difficult place for ASEAN. ASEAN has never sought to take sides amongst the great powers competing in its region. Indonesia has never sought to take sides. I mean, very much that being the part. Indonesia was a leader of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s, and that's very much part of the blood when Indonesia looks at what its role in the world is. So it's going to be a real challenge for Indonesia and its ASEAN chair this year.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that, especially on Indonesia as ASEAN chair and facing the one of the main challenges is the Myanmar, the crisis in Myanmar. There's a plan. Some said it's a plan, but also some said it's a rumor that Indonesia will delegate or will appoint the coordinating Minister of Investment and Maritime Affairs, Luhut Panjaitan, who is from the military who has a military background, and he will be the envoy to hold a dialogue with the Myanmar junta. And I see that is an interesting move, which a lot of people also think that is a smart move, because Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Retno, is a diplomat, and by sending like a former military person to deal with or speak with junta, a lot of people think that it's they can communicate more in the same language. So what do you think about that? What do you think? Is it gonna happen, and is it gonna make any difference? Is Indonesia's efforts going to contribute to the peace process or to a peace dialogue in ASEAN, and especially in Myanmar?
Luhut would be the third ASEAN envoy. ASEAN agreed with the junta in 2021 that it would appoint an envoy, and that envoy would be given access to all parties in Myanmar. There's been great frustration across ASEAN that the envoys have not, that the junta has not honored that promise. Could a military an envoy with military background have more progress? I think that the dynamics in Myanmar are about Myanmar, and Andrew, you can add as observers largely say the idea of a national ceasefire are minuscule to that the sides are dug in, and that no amount of diplomatic pressure is going to get you there, at least at the current time, that you're dealing with a process that's likely to take years. So, from the perspective of the generals, Luhut won't be envoy next year. He'll be envoy this year. There'll be another envoy next year. The resistance to the junta is widely divided, right? A whole bunch of forces, some of them who've been fighting the military for decades, some of whom are new since the coup, but my impression is they're dug in, and the military on the other side is not going to is not going to take part in a process of political dialogue, or it's really hard to see. I don't know, Andrew, do you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the chance for resolving this crisis in the short term is really hard to see. I think the question is what happens with ASEAN? Can they come together on a strategy or not? Right? They had these 5 points immediately after the coup that didn't really get anywhere. And it was clear that among the other countries, there were a lot of different opinions, from Cambodia's efforts to reach out to the Burmese military that didn't get anywhere, to Malaysia and Indonesia taking a more aggressive stance. I don't think either has been able to convince others in ASEAN of that, right? So the ASEAN way is supposed to be based on consensus and non-interference in internal affairs, but now there's no consensus, and it's hard to see how they could just accept the situation in Myanmar as an internal affair that doesn't affect them. So that's a real test for Indonesia's leadership. And I think for the whole ASEAN if they can manage to come to some common policy about Myanmar.
It's always a tough issue, and for this issue in particular, but also in general, to get all 10 member countries to have a consensus. Often it's a big challenge. I have experienced it firsthand when I was at the ASEAN Secretariat. I kind of want to touch a little bit upon so you mentioned about Cambodia, and that reminded me that Cambodia will also
has an election this year, yes.
Yeah, in July.
Mm-hmm.
And similar to other neighboring countries in ASEAN, a lot of issues happening. Prime Minister Hun Sen has recently targeted opposition figures and basically sent some kind of like threats to them. And last month, the authority arrested the vice president of the newly formed opposition party, which that party was surprisingly doing well in the local polls last year. So it's kind of concerning. And I would like to ask either Ben or Andrew to share any insight you have on that matter, or in general about the Cambodia's general election.
I can start and maybe Ben can add. So the opposition party that you're referring to is the Candlelight Party, which was formed after the previous opposition, Cambodia National Rescue Party, was banned and all of its leaders were tried in absentia overseas. So I mean, clearly this is an election that's being controlled by Hun Sen and the Cambodian People's Party. The last election, there was no opposition because they had all been prevented from running, and so no representation in the parliament at all. I think this year there'll be some, right? It's not going to be 100%, but clearly any sense that the opposition is gaining strength would be seen as a threat that they would crack down on right away. The other thing that's going on in Cambodian politics is the question of Hun Sen's succession. He's been in power now, well, since the mid-'80s, so one of the longest, if not the longest, reigning world leader around. He wants to pass on power to his son, Hun Manet, who is currently head of the armed forces. But he would only do that if he was quite sure that it was all set up for him, right? So that's one interpretation, that all of this crushing of the opposition is to pave the way for that transition, which could happen after the election this year, depending how things go. We don't really know what Hun Manet's policy positions are. He would probably be continuing in his father's footsteps, at least for now. But they're, among younger Cambodians, I think there's a lot of interest in change. So the phrase democratic discontent that Mega brought up at the beginning, I think applies quite well in Cambodia. It's just a question of when it comes out and how.
Ben, any additional comment from you?
No, I completely agree. I think the question, it's been asked in other countries, when a long time leader leaves the scene, or at least leaves the chair, if not leaving the scene, what happens to the discontent is an important one. I think that over the next 5 to 10 years is really the question in Cambodia.
Thank you. I want to check the Q&A box. We have probably answered some of the questions related to Thailand. Please feel free to add any comments you might have related to the questions in the chat box. Have the United States further interest in foreign direct investment in Thailand? Is the strong US-Thai relationship a priority for the United States? How upsetting to the government are the street protests in Thailand? Why does the Thailand economy do well despite of the coup? How does the Thai government receive agencies that try to develop civil or pro-democracy organizations? Ben or Andrew, any of these questions, I'm just reading for the audience here, any of these questions you would like to dig deeper into?
I could say a couple more things in addition to my earlier answer. So, I mean, after the last military coup in Thailand, right, the US kept relations. They're still an ally. We didn't isolate them. And that was partly a realization that that would push them closer to China. And also a hope that over time, democratic forces would come back. So Thailand continues to be important for the US, but as I understand, US policy has been to keep things quiet and play a longer game. So we'll see where that goes. On the last question about civil society or pro-democracy organizations, I mean, there is space in Thailand to have a domestic civil society as long as it doesn't directly oppose the monarchy. That's the red line. We've seen in protests in recent years, there are new forms of civil society that are youth-led coming up. There are a lot of international organizations with offices in Thailand. They tend to stay away from directly supporting that kind of political protest. So I think there are some limits there, but there is space to have these discussions. And Thailand has gone back and forth from being democratic to authoritarian and back again, right? So people have experience of both. Anything you'd add, Ben?
Yeah, there's absolutely space for civil society in Thailand. I mean, it was very much both pre-coup, it was a deeply developed place for civil society of all or many areas. One of the things, I mean, it's just tangential, but Indonesia, the last time it chaired ASEAN 10 years ago, initiated a regional civil society dialogue on the outskirts of, or on the outside of the ASEAN leaders meeting, which was an interesting idea. It didn't gain momentum. ASEAN went through too many authoritarian chairs in the subsequent years. But for a nation like Indonesia that sees its sort of democratic character as part of its identity in over the past quarter century, rebuilding that might be a strong thing to do, because connecting, you're basically connecting regional groups that are working on similar areas. That doesn't, I mean, it doesn't have to be political. It can be all any number of areas, environmental, education, so on and so forth. That was something Indonesia, under a previous president, sought to do, and I don't know if a future government might see fit to do it.
Yeah, that could be a great idea or inspiration for the current chairmanship. Let's see what's going to happen. We have one more question. I think we do have time for this. It's for Malaysia. It's a Malaysia issue from Mary Quinn Mills. How heavily does religion influence politics in Malaysia? And was it a force in the most recent election? Ben?
Yeah. Heavily. In many ways, Anwar Ibrahim's choice to do a deal with the old political force of UMNO was aimed at keeping a much more heavily Islamist party in the minority. Malaysian politics, one of the dominant divides within Malaysian politics is the role of Islam in society, and the preferences that are given to indigenous Bumiputras, the majority Malays and other indigenous peoples, which is another. Which is another issue that it casts religion very much in the forefront. So Anwar, that is another pressure that he is under to preserve. Anwar as a young man had deep Islamic bona fides. He was an Islamic student as a young man, and is generally acknowledged to have been deeply religious back then, deeply religious today. But the whole question of your sort of Islamic legitimacy is very much part of the prism with which many Malay voters choose their leaders. So yes, very heavy, and as I say, the formation of this coalition rather than a different coalition was really important in that debate over what role Islam should play in politics in Malaysia.
That prompted me to a follow-up question. Same question about Indonesia. How much do you think religion will play into the upcoming election? It has shown some like religious influence in the past elections, especially not only presidential election but also governor election last few years in Indonesia. So yeah, I'm interested to know your take on the Indonesia's election and its relationship with the religious movements in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, obviously, in Indonesia also plays a huge role. In the previous election, President Widodo's choice of his vice presidential as his vice president was a very clear effort to shore up his Islamic flank, if you will. He chose the chairman of the world's largest lay Muslim organization, Nahdlatul Ulama. And yes, when we talk about the new and the old, I mean, Prabowo in the previous election sought very much to cast aspersions on whether Joko Widodo was even Muslim, right? There was a great deal of misinformation thrown out there. Some of it had to do with the fact that one of his closest political allies was an ethnic Chinese Christian who had risen to become governor of Jakarta, and Prabowo played on that to say, hey, this guy, he's not one of us. And it, I mean, it didn't win Prabowo the election, but it was there, and it was clearly something that President Widodo knew he had to address. He could say, I'm a true devout Muslim 1,000 times, but you've got the guy out there saying, trying to cast aspersions on the notion of whether he was or not. I'd imagine that sort of misinformation, political dirty tricks, so forth, could well play a role in this one too.
Thank you, Ben. Unfortunately, we're run out of time. Just a quick, I think, takeaway that I had from this session is, despite the challenges that democracy face in ASEAN and probably in the world, and this noting that democracy will not always be clean and flawless all the time, but it does not mean there's no hope for political stability and prosperity in the region. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists today, excellent panelists, Ben Dolven and Andrew Wellsdown. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your expertise. We're so lucky to have you and being able to hearing your in-depth insight surrounding the political issues in ASEAN. Thanks to everyone who have joined us today. And now I'll turn the screen back over to Leon for a final announcement. Thanks, everyone.
Mega, I greatly appreciate the time you took today to be our moderator and to offer your thoughts to our audience today. I would also like to thank Dr. Wellsdown and Mr. Dolven for joining us and providing such excellent insights into Southeast Asia and its political developments. We are honored to host you and appreciate the time you have taken out of your schedule to deliver your valuable perspectives. And though we're out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usaiinstitute.org, and we'll be happy to assist you in furthering further dialogue on the issues we have discussed today. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And the recording will be up for anyone who wants to view this in the future. Thank you again to our panelists and everyone who has attended, and have a good day.